right. Well, then, hello, everybody. I'm excited that you're all here with us today to talk about medical devices and wellness devices with Heather Bustos, owner and partner at Bustos Law Group. And as always, my name is Susanne. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citrus Steps, and Citrus Steps provides clinical trials for brands such as supplements, cosmetics, and also devices. And we are hosting this series to bring resources to you to start and scale your brands. Some housekeeping. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A box or in the chat. And now let's just start. Heather, hello. Thank you for your time today. We are super excited to learn more about devices today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me as well. Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So Heather, you are an attorney. You're working with a lot of supplements, cosmetics, and also devices, and you make sure that they're compliant with FDA and FTC regulations. And can you tell us a little bit more about what you actually do?
Yeah, of course. So as you mentioned, we help brands essentially with compliance under FDA regulations. We do some FTC, a little bit of customs as well, kind of all goes hand in hand. We deal with clients in the food, supplement, cosmetic, and medical device spaces. And we have clients ranging from manufacturers and distributors to importers and brand owners. So kind of all across the supply chain. Some of the things that we do are things like label and marketing reviews. We help with quality compliance, so auditing, SOPs, things like that, annual registration, recalls, and even import issues. So our team is based, basically we have a group of consultants and attorneys. They're either former FDA or have been in the industry for at least 10 years or more. So we have a pretty solid team, and that's a little bit about Bustos Law Group and what we're trying to do.
That's awesome. And obviously today we will talk about devices. And I think there are two types of devices, right? They are wellness devices and then they are medical devices. And can you tell us a little bit, about the difference between these devices, specifically from a legal perspective?
Sure. So I guess the first thing I'm going to say is when you're dealing with general wellness, you actually, from a strategic perspective, don't want to call it a device. It's really, so if you're looking at the difference, and this is kind of, how people in the industry describe it, a medical device, let's say, is classified as a 1, 2, or 3, whereas a wellness is almost like a class 0. It's not actually regulated as a device. So it's intended only to be used for a general healthy lifestyle, and it presents a really minimal risk to the safety of users and others. So that's why we call it kind of like a class 0 in that way. And then on the other side, a medical device is obviously more heavily regulated, has a lot more requirements, but I'll try to synthesize the definition because it's kind of long. But essentially, it's an instrument, apparatus, machine, or other similar or related article. Will include software in that definition, including a component, part, or accessory. And it's something that is intended for the use in diagnosis or treatment of diseases, conditions, or intended to affect the structure or function of the body. So that's kind of, it's a really loaded definition. There's a lot of different moving parts to it. But that's kind of the difference, is the amount of regulation that applies, and kind of the risk level is something that's also taken into consideration.
That's very interesting. And isn't the Band-Aid a class 1 device?
Yes, it is. There are a lot of things you would be shocked are devices. But it's all based on, obviously the amount of risk. Like if a Band-Aid doesn't work properly, it can cause infection, right? So you got to kind of think through the amount of risk. And that's kind of the reason why it becomes a regulated medical device.
Okay. And do you know what a gua sha roller is? These rollers for your face that
I've heard of them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
would
like with
you say that these
circulation.
are yeah, would you say that these are wellness devices or wellness things, or medical devices?
I think it could depend on the claims. That's a good question. I would have to look a little deeper into exactly how it functions, but my understanding, and I've seen this with certain quote unquote cosmetic slash medical, where it's kind of
Uh-huh.
like towing the line. It kind of in those cases it could sometimes fall on how deep it penetrates the skin, because I've heard of things
Mhm.
like microneedling, for example,
Yeah.
where depending on how deep it penetrates, it may be considered a device or a cosmetic. So, yeah, there's a couple factors that I would look at to determine whether those were. I'm going to give you the lawyer answer. It's like it depends, right?
That's okay, that's okay. And, what obviously, the actual medical devices, they fall under FDA regulation. And then the wellness
Right.
devices, do they have any regulations they have to follow?
So it's interesting. General wellness, I'm trying to remember the year that came out. I want to say it was like 2012 or something. Don't quote me on that, but I want to say it was relatively recently that FDA came out with this general wellness category. And it's not even under necessarily the regulations, which are, the Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 21 is where the FDA regulations fall. General wellness is kind of this carve out, and it's really it sits under this FDA guidance. So if you're not familiar with these guidances, the agency puts out these guidances. They're not binding law per se, but they kind of give you an idea of the agency's thinking about certain things. So FDA created this kind of carve out for certain products that are low risk, um, and are intended for just like general wellness of the user. And so it's completely based on this guidance that came out, and not really rooted in regulation.
Mhm. That's interesting. Well, it's good that they do have these guidelines, guidance, even though it's not a law, because then you know what you can and can't do, and probably also can't get into trouble if you follow these, right?
Yeah, we do. I do my best. I do have a client currently that we're in arguments with the FDA about it. And, what I try to do is just use the exact terminology from that guidance back at FDA and say, like, hey, like, this is what you said. So we're just doing exactly what you said. And, we're still waiting to hear back on FDA. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but we're hoping that we get a positive reaction from them.
Yeah, and if you're using the exact terminology, and it should work out,
Right.
knock on wood.
Exactly. Right.
And you already touched on the word claims, right? It depends on what claims you want to make. And claims are typically always on top of mind at also these webinars. And I know that everybody is dying to get some pointers here. And what's the difference in claims companies can make on medical devices versus wellness, let's call them products?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's going to be very different, Suzanne, from what we've talked about in the past in other areas like cosmetics or
Hmm.
supplements or food. It's definitely a different perspective. That's what makes my job interesting. I think I'd be bored otherwise, is kind of, having these different practice areas. So I want to kind of go back first to a little bit more about the definition so that I can flesh out the claims part of it. So, like I said, general wellness is going to be considered low risk devices intended to promote the wellness of the user. They can discuss the product being used to help living with certain diseases, but we'll dig a little deeper into that. And these are things like a pedometer, a sleep monitor, exercise equipment, and really in those situations, you're very limited on claims on what you can say the product can do. When it comes to medical devices, as I mentioned before, they're classified into three classes: class one, two, or three. So,
Hmm.
class one usually doesn't require any kind of pre market application. These are things like you said, a band aid, a toothbrush, handheld surgical tools. Class two requires something called a pre-market clearance. So people like to say, oh, it's FDA approved. Approval doesn't even, it's not the correct terminology for class two. And those require, like I said, pre-market clearance or what's called a 510K in the
Yeah.
industry. These are things like blood pressure cuffs, syringes, contact lenses. And then the level 3 are the highest amount of risk. These are things that like a pacemaker or a defibrillator where there's really high risk and you need a lot of controls to make sure that it's safe for the user. So that's a little bit about kind of like the basis. And then when it comes to the claims, we'll go back to the general wellness side. So there's actually 2 categories of claims. Anyone who's looking to go into this space of general wellness, or if you're in it and you're trying to, look at how to craft claims, I would highly recommend checking out the guidance. I think it's really well written and it's pretty clear on what you can or can't do for the most part. So the first category is no reference to diseases or conditions. Some of these examples are things like promotes relaxation or manages stress, promotes or maintains a healthy weight, encourages healthy eating. A lot of that is things like apps, for example, that, track eating or your nutrition, things like that. And then the second category is where you can make reference to diseases or conditions. So there's kind of 2 subcategories. One is it promotes, tracks, or encourages healthy choices and may reduce the risk of chronic disease. Another is may help living with certain chronic diseases. So I'll give you some examples. That's the best way to kind of explain it. So one is an example would be a software product that coaches breathing techniques and relaxation skills. And your claim could be, as part of a healthy lifestyle, it may help living with migraine headaches. So you're still able to use a disease or condition, but you have to kind of frame it in a way that just says our device is going to help you living with this by promoting a healthy lifestyle. Another is, promotes physical activity, and that can help with reducing the risk of high blood pressure. So it's all about the way you frame it. It's not, in this case, you're not saying we're treating or preventing a disease or condition per se. We're just using that product in combination with a healthy lifestyle to, have these sorts of effects. So that's on the general wellness side. And then on the medical device side, you're really kind of limited to the regulation. So the way, and this is really dumbing it down because based on, depending on the class that you're in, it may kind of shift a little bit. But essentially, when you fall, so what you want to try to do when you're classifying a device is find a matching regulation that kind of defines what your device does. And so you're limited by what that regulation states. So I'll give you an example. That's always the best is giving hypotheticals. And this is actually from a client that I worked with. I still have them as a client, but essentially they sell something called an impedance plethysmograph. It's a mouthful. So this is a device that essentially the user stands on, and it uses electrical impedance to it generates electricity through the body, and it allows you to measure certain things like body fat, water, certain things within the body. And so that is considered a class 2. But within the regulation, it states when it's considered a body composition analyzer, which is not intended to diagnose a treatment or condition, then it's not required to have, let's say, a pre-market application. So you're limited in that case. And my client was as well. And I'll give you an example. In their case, they considered it a body composition analyzer. It's limited by the regulation. You cannot use any statements of intending to diagnose or treat medical conditions. If you do, it's considered now class 2, requiring a 510K. My client didn't want to file a 510K. It's very costly, and I'm sure we'll get into that part later. It's very costly to brands to file that. So in this case, they said, we don't want to do a 510K. We'll keep it within that category. Their marketing team started making claims, and the FDA, what they did was sent them something called an "it has come to our attention" letter, which is essentially putting the brand on notice. Hey, you said you said when you went to market it was only going to be this type of device. You're making these claims. Let us know, where's your backing for this? Do you have the pre-market application? That is not something that goes public per se. And if you ever do receive that, you want to respond, it's something to definitely take seriously. It's the FDA kind of giving you a hint, like, hey, we're giving you this hint. Don't go outside the bounds of what you're allowed to do. And in that case, we were able to remove the claims. So really going back to the question at heart is, you're really limited by the regulation that you fall under and what that regulation says. Some of them are very broad. Some of them are very narrow, where you have a very specific intended use and you cannot go outside that. So that's really where the claims are. And then going into like the substantiation part, which is the FTC side, on the general wellness side, you really just want to make sure your claims are truthful, not misleading. You want to have safety substantiation. And then on the medical device side, when it comes to FTC, which FTC does not discriminate, every product under their jurisdiction is required to have a certain level of substantiation. And on the medical device side, you're usually going to find health claims. So claims that affect the health of the user. And in that case, you want to use clinical trials to support those claims. And like I said, that's not just medical devices, that's any product that FTC regulates. If it is considered a health claim, they're going to require that kind of substantiation.
Well, that's great. Okay. So, two categories with wellness products. The first one, you shouldn't make any markers in regards to any health conditions, but you can say it promotes relaxation, reduces stress, promotes healthy weight. And the second one, you can, for example, may reduce the risk of chronic disease and living well with chronic disease. I think one thing that you told me once was that was in regards to supplements. Supplements should keep healthy people healthy, right? And I think this probably also somewhat relies to the wellness category, right?
Yeah, it's a very similar kind of thought process in crafting claims. Absolutely.
Yeah. And obviously, FTC is really behind with claims currently. I think earlier this year they sent out 700 warning letters for two companies that had not the substantiation apparently for their claims. So, to our audience, in case you want to make claims, always make sure that you have the correct substantiation in terms of clinical trials, especially when you're making health claims, because otherwise the FTC will probably knock on your door sooner or later.
Right. Absolutely. I agree with that. And they're much more aggressive than FDA, in my opinion, as an agency as a whole. So you definitely want to be careful, cautious with substantiation, making sure you have it on file.
Yeah. And from your experience, Heather, what are some common challenges that are typically faced by medical device companies, wellness device companies, specifically during this compliance process? You already mentioned the 510K, for example. You said that this is costly. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So if we're talking about 510K specifically, it is a major hurdle from a cost perspective and from a time perspective. If you're trying to bring a product to market quickly, it's not a good pathway. But obviously, there are cases where there's no other choice, right? It all depends on the intended use of the product. I have clients who sell the same exact product under general wellness and also have a 510K. And it's all based on the claims being made. So, ultimately, that's all strategy. And I would say it kind of goes to really like the main way I want to answer this question, which is classification is the most vital part of the process. And I think people want to just jump in right away and just, try to get going on a project. You need to take the time to properly classify that device and really, work with a professional to review and strategize, because there have been cases where I've had clients that come in from the get-go in their consultation and they're like, I know that I fall under 21 CFR part 800 on this, and they're like set. And then I've been able to do the research and say, wait a second, there's some things you want to consider from a strategy perspective where we may be able to fall under a lower classification. My perspective is I'm always looking at the least burdensome regulatory approach. So how can we get to market the quickest with the least amount of money, and having to comply with the least amount of regulations? There are some cases where it's impossible, right? If you're selling a pacemaker, that's not really possible to kind of shift between classes. But there are a lot of cases where devices can do that and you can change. So for example, I've had clients that we came into the market under general wellness. We made very little claims, watered down. As the company, built up their capital through that general wellness pathway, they then shifted their intended use to something under the 510K pathway or under a class 1 pathway. So it all depends. So I think that is the most vital thing to consider at the very beginning, even if you already have your product on the market. There's a lot of clients I've dealt with that their product has been on the market for years and they still haven't taken the time to classify or strategize. And that can save you a lot of money, a lot of headaches, a lot of just problems that you might deal with. Especially, you don't want to be on the side with the agency where it's they're aggressive towards you, or even be on their radar for that matter. And so, the consideration of classification in the very beginning or at some point is really vital, in my opinion. And that would save a lot of my clients from the headaches they deal with. And when they come to me already being in trouble, that's where the issues come in.
Yeah, and you already mentioned these letters. It has come to our attention, and
Yeah.
you already mentioned that when you receive that letter, you should take it serious, and you should definitely reply to that letter. And can
Yeah.
you give us some examples of devices that face compliance issues and lessons learned, apart from obviously making it very clear at the beginning, in terms of which classification you fall under?
Sure, absolutely. So some examples of, for instance, in the general wellness space, it's usually the issue is making improper claims. So going outside of what the guidance allows.
Hmm.
Like I said, I have a client now that has a product that, and this happens, and people may not be aware. So even if the product itself, when you look at it, you're like, this is not a device. When you look at the way it's being used, it's not a device. It's not high risk. It meets all of the requirements of general wellness from its functionality. The minute you make a claim outside of general wellness, the FDA
Hmm.
considers it a device. So it's really important that you have, whether it's an attorney, or there are many compliance consultants that, again, are former FDA that are really great at doing this. You need to make sure that as your product continues in the market, you're constantly reviewing that marketing and the claims that you're making to make sure that it stays within that category, especially general wellness. That is something that you're not going to get an answer. Well, let me correct myself. There has only been, of all the clients I've worked with on general wellness, I've had one client that has been successful in getting FDA to confirm that it's general wellness. It's very rare that FDA will tell you, yeah, sure, it's a general wellness product. So you're kind of operating in this, area where you don't have a lot of guidance. You don't have, an exact rule of law, like a regulation that's giving you, exactly what needs to happen or doesn't need to happen. So in those cases, you need to be even more cautious. And another example of some compliance issues I've dealt with are on the import side. So if you do import medical devices, you want to be really sure that the products are compliant prior to import. So I had a client, for example, that was doing, it was like a haptic sock, and essentially, the product itself, very low risk, but ultimately the claims that were being made were outside of class one. And so in that case,
Mhm.
the product, the client rather had to spend tons of money. They had to deal with the FDA holding the product for a very long period of time. These are not quick things for the most part. Once your product, is being held by FDA, you have to answer, back and forth with different correspondence. You have to deal with strategizing. You also have to pay for the product as it's being held and stored. The FDA requires you to pay those fees. So there's a lot of headaches that come with products being stopped. And so it's really important that you ensure that the product is compliant before you import.
Wow, that you have to pay for the product when it's being stopped and
Yeah.
stored, basically paying a
Mhm.
storage fee. That is very interesting.
Yeah, you're paying that. And then in the case of the socks, we had submitted to FDA a plan to relabel. So you can do things where you suggest to FDA, we're going to sticker the items. So we're going to apply a
Mhm.
sticker over any of the claims. It has to be a sticker that can't easily be removed. So we put together this whole plan, like, okay, we're going to resticker. The FDA said, sure, no problem. And then when the client was thinking about the logistics of actually getting the stickering done, and having their so this was an international company, they would have had to have their staff come do all the restickering of thousands of products. It would have taken those employees away from their job, and they realized all the cost associated. They ended up realizing that the cost of doing that was a lot less than just saying we'll just destroy the product.
Okay, just
And so
destroy the product and then just do it again with
yeah,
correct
just keep
labeling.
it, yeah, a lot of it comes down to cost considerations and what makes sense, to the business. And in that case, even though the stickering was approved by FDA, it would have cost more money to do it. So the client decided we'll just destroy the product, and you can destroy or actually export it back. There's two options. And even then they felt that destroying was actually cheaper in that case.
That's very interesting. And then
Yeah.
one thing that we relatively often stumble upon when we are working with devices is in-home use studies for devices. So these studies are not necessarily to get you, you know, specific outcome like with a 510K or show that your product is safe, but it's more, that to show that, for example, we have one client currently that has a device that's FDA approved. I think it's class 3 device,
Mhm.
and they this device, it's a sleep device that has been used by hospitals, uh, sleep labs, and so on. And now they want to show that this device can also be used at home. So this is why
Right.
they decided to work with us in an in-home use study. And
Mhm.
how do these in-home use studies, in your opinion, impact also the compliance of medical devices?
So there's two considerations there. I mean, one is the FDA does regulate the in-home use, and there are guidances on this.
Mhm.
In for medical devices, if you want to shift the use to in-home use, so anyone who's thinking of doing that, there's definitely guidances you can look up on the FDA website for how to accomplish that in a way that FDA would be okay with. When it comes to the data that you're trying to pull from these studies, like any studies, and I think it's important that companies really consider the limitations based on the classification of the device. So whatever results you want to accomplish, the idea is before the study even begins, you want to kind of narrow the questions to fall within the intended use of the device, so that the data that you come out with is usable and obviously compliant with whatever classification your device falls under.
That makes sense. And then obviously looking again, right, at the claims in case you want to make claims that these comply also with FTC.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Heather. That was amazing. And if people want to reach out to you, how can they find you? And what's your email? What's your phone number?
Yes, so just like on the slide, bustoslawgroup.com is our website. And then the email is info@bustoslawgroup.com. The phone number is 832-592-7851.
Great, and I think we are ready for some Q&A. So we had one question that you may or may not be able to answer because it is for European device laws, specifically LED. Do you have any idea, any connections, any references how to navigate EU laws?
So really our firm focuses on US laws and bringing products into the US. So I don't have a lot of background on EU requirements. Yeah, I would probably say you would need to find an attorney on that side, because really we focus on the US side, and that is more than enough on our end to keep up with the regulations.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. It's as a person from Europe, it's an entirely different
Yeah.
playing field in Europe. A lot of different regulations. Are there any other questions?
I have a
Uh,
question regarding what kinds of things you guys can do for medical device clients.
yeah, so
What are some things
obviously,
that you guys provide?
yeah, obviously we are a clinical study provider, and we can help devices to actually get the substantiation they need. Safety studies, for example, typically top of mind for the 510(k) applications. They typically smaller randomized control studies. And also specifically for claims, obviously, most of our clients are very interested in receiving claims. We can conduct several study types, starting with, typically specifically for wellness products, consumer perception studies that are more on the more cost efficient, more cost effective end, than going through single group clinical studies to actual randomized control studies that are a little bit more expensive. But obviously, randomized control studies, I don't think there is a law that tells you how big a study should be. Study should always have power, which means that, should be able to get to statistical significance. So you need like a certain threshold of study participants to actually enroll in your study and then also complete the study. But a lot of people think that you need like thousands of study participants in order to have an actual study, which is not the case.
Yeah, and I think it is important before when you're reaching out to labs, to understand what they do. I've had clients that, just thought all labs do everything. It's the same as like, oh, an
No.
attorney can just, do any area of law. And that's not the case. You want them to be specializing in what, the result you're trying to attain.
Exactly, yeah, and a lot of CROs, contract research organizations, they do work with a lot of pharmaceutical biotech clients, and what we often found is that they are actually over engineering studies.
Oh, wow.
Can you explain how consumer perception studies can help with a general wellness product? So consumer perception studies are found in specifically in the cosmetic category, where you basically, are asking for the perception. So for example, we talked at the very beginning, we talked about gua sha device. I just call it the device because it is a device. I think gua sha should help, to help your cosmetics to absorb better. For example, if you have a serum, it should absorb better. And then I think, Heather, there are these very nice claims that you can say with helps to reduce the appearance of fine lines and wrinkles, helps to increase the appearance or look of skin brightness. And this is how a perception study can actually help to get you the substantiation you need for specifically, I would say, wellness cosmetic claims.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And there are cases where a product that's not, so for example, everyone thinks of cosmetics traditionally as the thing you pour on yourself, the thing, but it could also include the apparatus you use to apply certain products. I mean,
Mhm.
it goes out a little further than that. And it all goes back to intended use, in my opinion, where it can fall in different categories.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, if you want to make a health claim, and I think you mentioned, Heather, that it's about how deep it penetrates. For example, the skin microneedling would probably be a health claim in that
Yeah.
regard. So then you would
Mhm.
need an RCT, a randomized control study. And
Yeah. And
probably,
we're definitely, go ahead.
yeah, because I think for microneedling, you probably will not have a placebo. And I think what you can do is then just have a control group, for example, one group that's doing that microneedling and the other group is doing nothing.
Right. Yeah, and we're seeing this crossover a lot more of like the cosmetic and device realm and how
Hmm.
those can kind of intertwine. And a lot of people think that like anything involving beauty is just automatically a cosmetic, and that's not always the case. So it's really
Yeah,
important to understand how those two intertwine based on how the product is intended to be used.
absolutely. Yeah. Are there any more questions? I give everybody 5 more seconds. All right. Great. Well, then, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in today. Our next webinar is on August 24th, in which we'll talk about how to create research-backed product claims with objective data for supplements and cosmetics. And we also published our podcast episode with Heather on product claims on our podcast From Lab to Label, in which we also reveal a bunch of low risk claims that brands can make when they have obviously the substantiation. And it's an amazing episode, and you should definitely not miss it. Well, then, thanks everybody for tuning in again. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.